Okay, so our next screencast, I should say, our last sort of look at classical supply side view of economics is going to look at, again, three different examples of classical economic equilibrium or disequilibrium. The first case here, all the way over and to the right of your screen, we're looking here at a macroeconomy that's at equilibrium. In other words, the actual output as determined by the short-run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve, that output, the actual output, is the same as the potential output at long-run aggregate supply. What does that mean? Well, remember, long-run aggregate supply, this is what supply-siders believe that in the long run, when all prices in any kind of an economy adjust, we will always end up working at full employment. In other words, if every factor of production is put to work to the best of its ability, we'll be at long-run aggregate supply. In this case, in the short run here, in any given time in the short run, when prices are determining output, we actually find that the actual output is equal to the potential output. I'm sorry, the potential output is equal to the actual output. We're right there on potential output. The economy is working to the best of its ability. This is an economy that's in equilibrium. This is an economy that's not. In this case here, we have any number of circumstances. We have an equilibrium where the actual output is greater than the potential output. We might find that there was some government policies that maybe taxes were too low, any number of things. It doesn't really matter what, but at this point we see that when this is happening, when equilibrium here is greater than the potential output, the actual output is greater than the potential output, we're actually in disequilibrium. What the supply sider is saying is that at this point here, all the factors of production are being put to work and then some, right? Because at this point, all the factors of production are at full employment. At this point, they're beyond full employment. This means that there's greater demand for those factors of production than there is the ability to supply. We're working beyond capacity. Anytime we're working beyond capacity with any of our factors of production, that's going to push the prices of those factors of production up. So for example, let's say we're looking at Wellesley Square, and at this point here in long-run aggregate supply, every storefront in Wellesley Square is full of a store. There's a store there. There's somebody renting it. At this point, what we see is that every store is rented, and other people are coming in trying to rent those stores as well. In other words, we're actually going to push up the price of rent on stores because we're beyond capacity. The economy's trying to expand, but there's no capacity to expand. This is like you trying to pull all-nighters studying all the time. You can't do it over the long run. What ends up happening here in the long run is that because this point here puts pressure on factor markets to drive up prices, the prices of those factors get higher. And then what we do is we find that the short run aggregate supply curve is actually going to shift because resource prices are a determinant of short run aggregate supply. Those are meant to be parallel. So short run aggregate supply actually shifts and eventually ends up back on the long-run aggregate supply curve. In other words, the equilibrium returns to potential output. This is an inflationary gap, and with no intervention from the government, the inflationary gap will close. Prices in the factor markets in and of themselves will close down that gap. We'll be back to long-run aggregate supply. Why is this an inflationary gap? Because it's pushing prices up. So the classical economist says, hey, listen, we're working beyond capacity in the economy. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it because market forces in the factor markets all by themselves will cause changes in prices to shift the aggregate supply curve so that we end up back here on long-run aggregate supply. Now, the last example here we're going to look at, deflationary gap. Here's the deflationary gap. This is just the reverse of the inflationary gap. We're at actual output that is something below potential output. This means that resources are underutilized. There are some storefronts that are empty. There's some people out of work. Any number of reasons we're below what we call full employment in the economy. So when that's the case, we're going to see that there's going to be a pressure on prices to drop. There's more people to work than there are jobs to do. the prices of labor is going to drop. As the price of labor drops, aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply will start to shift, and it'll keep shifting until we come back to an equilibrium that's on the long-run aggregate supply curve. Now, we said employment, but we could think of any factor of production, the prices are going to drop. Just like in the inflationary gap, factor market prices by themselves will close the gap. In the deflationary gap, factor market prices by themselves will close the gap. The classical economist believes that all of this will happen on its own. All of this is going to happen on its own. The only thing that government really should be concerning itself with is how to get this long-run aggregate supply curve to move out to the right. The supply sider believes we're always going to be on the long-run aggregate supply curve. The only time that we're not, don't worry about it because we're coming back to it. The supply sider believes that in the long run, we're always going to end up here. If we're here or here, market forces are going to push us back to here. We're always going to be at potential output. The economy is always going to be working at peak efficiency in the long run. We've drawn 3 production possibilities curves very, very quickly in the bottom. In this view, we're on the PPC. In this view, we're outside the PPC. In this view, we're inside the PPC. In every case, the classical supply sider says market forces are going to push us back here. So this situation or this situation, either one are going to push us. The prices in the factor markets by themselves will push us back to an equilibrium where potential and actual output are the same. I don't know if we can see this here. We can't see it on the top. That's why we call people who are classical economists supply siders. They believe that what you do is you manage long-run aggregate supply. This long-run aggregate supply is going to be what determines output in an economy. Aggregate demand is never going to determine output in an economy because we're always going to be coming back to long-run aggregate supply. Aggregate demand shifts, changes in factor market prices are just going to bring the output back to long-run aggregate supply. Classical economists believe there's very little for government to do. Basically, government should print money and then kind of get out of the way. So these are the different views of classical economics. That this is equilibrium, macroeconomic equilibrium in the model in the classical view.